After the Russian Civil War, the new Republican government was in a bit of a mess. After Kolchak's attempted coup, the government got into the habit of tightening its grip on the country whenever they saw something they didn't like, leading to economic stagnation, military incompetence, and social unrest. However, through questionable means, Alexander Kerensky had managed to hide away many of these problems behind a veil of peace and stability in Russia. Unfortunately, this facade would shatter with Kerensky's assassination. Almost overnight, Russia was thrown into chaos as many of the problems Kerensky had been hiding away came to light. In an attempt to restore some semblance of peace, Dmitry Romanov ascended to the role of acting president while the Senate prepared for a snap election. But with the collapse of the KDP-PSR coalition, actually holding the election seemed like an impossible task. As if to add fuel to the fire, syndicalists and members of the NPRP would stage protests in Petrograd, and to make a hellish situation even worse, the day after the protests, the Berlin stock market collapsed, sending the Russian economy into freefall. With all the chaos and confusion going on in Russia, many were reminded of the chaos in 1917, and as a second civil war seemed inevitable, a black horse rode out, and Russia was silent once more. In April of 1936, Lavar Kornilov, with the support of several high-ranking Russian generals, led a coup against the PSR's minority government. Using the army, Kornilov was able to quickly consolidate his rule, and a military dictatorship was established in Russia. While Kornilov had brought a sense of stability back to Russia, his health was worsening, and his days were numbered. Kornilov knew that without a worthy successor, Russia would once again fall into chaos, and while many expected him to pick either Anton Denikin or Pyotr Wrangel as his successor, Kornilov chose one Boris Savinkov. Savinkov was an interesting man, a former terrorist turned writer and leader of the NPRP. While many in government found Savinkov to be an authoritarian radical at best and a dictatorial extremist at worst, no one dared speak against Kornilov's choice, so upon his death in March of 1937, Savinkov merged the posts of president and prime minister and replaced Kornilov's military dictatorship with his own super gamer military dictatorship. Savinkov's first endeavor as Russia's new Vozhd would be to reform the army. While there were slightly more important things he could have done, like, fixing the economy and indoctrinating the population, Savinkov knew that if he fixed the army, then the army probably wouldn't coup him, and it might even become loyal to him. Fixing the army was way easier than he had expected, so after he fixed it, Savinkov decided that it was time to fix the Russian government. So he began a massive anti-corruption campaign that basically boiled down to, let's shoot anyone that's accused of corruption. Surprisingly, shooting people just because you think they're corrupt proved very efficient at eradicating and dissuading people from being corrupt. So with that success under his belt, Savinkov then decided that instead of a police force, Russia would have the Nadzgvardia, a paramilitary organization that was tasked with shooting any and all opposition to Savinkov's rule. Again, the Nadzgvardia proved very efficient, so Savinkov decided that he would establish the VSNKH, an organization that would centralize the economy and shoot anyone that disagreed with that plan. Are you starting to see a pattern here? In his eternal wisdom, Savinkov discovered that the easiest way to make people do whatever he wanted was by threatening to shoot them. And surprisingly, people didn't like to get shot, so very quickly the Russian population just started going along with whatever Savinkov said, which led to the Russian youth being indoctrinated into Savinkov's ideology, because the alternative was their parents being killed for teaching them anti-Savinkovist ideas. He also decided to start a massive fucking purge for no reason. Eventually, Savinkov grew tired of oppressing his own people, so he decided that it was time to make Russia great again. Savinkov started his restoration by attempting to reclaim the Caucasus. While some of the Caucasus nations decided to join Russia peacefully because fighting a war isn't fun, some of the Caucasus nations decided that they liked being independent. Unfortunately for them, Russia is a massive country with a massive industry and a massive population, so they didn't really stand a chance. After the Caucasus were back under his control, Savinkov's next target was Transamur, but unfortunately Turkestan decided that it was wartime, so now you've got to go deal with that. Don't you just love fighting a war in Central Asia with no supply? Isn't that super cool and epic, and oh my fucking god, I'm having so much fun! Eventually, Savinkov would finally get around to invading Transamur, and when he did, the Winter War as it came to be known was a complete nightmare. It was a land war in fucking Siberia, of course it was awful. But while his soldiers were suffering in the hell we mortals know as Sibirskaya, Savinkov got interested in the concept of Eurasia, which led him to meeting with the Eurasianists, which were a funny group of people that, well, the whole world belongs to Holy Russia! There's bugs in my eyes! They're in my eyes! Enlightened by Eurasianism, Savinkov realized that instead of just restoring Russia to its former glory, he could expand Russia to make a new and improved glory. So naturally, he declared war on Germany. Savinkov's invasion of the Reichspakt started off very well, with the Russian armies managing to overrun the Reichspakt armies in the east without taking a lot of losses. And while one could be forgiven for thinking that this was because the Russian army was superior to the Reichspakt army, that wasn't really the case. While the Russian army was undoubtedly one of the strongest armies in the world at this point, it wasn't inherently better than the German army. You see, when the Russian invasion began, the Second Weltkriege had already been going on for the better part of a year, meaning that the Germans had already been fighting a war against the syndicalist powers in the West. And like any competent map gamer will tell you, fighting a war on two fronts is really fucking hard. The Germans knew they couldn't win this war, which meant they had to pick between the lesser of two evils. On one hand, the syndicalists probably didn't want to dismantle Germany. On the other hand, they were syndicalists, so the Germans decided that if they were going to lose the war, they might as well surrender to the Russians, because there was that one time Savinkov said the Serena was sexy, which obviously meant that he didn't hate the monarchy and would let them exist after the war. So after a few years of the German army retreating to the Western Front and the Russian army pushing towards Berlin, the Second Weltkriege came to an anticlimactic end. Now you can probably imagine that the Third International was a tad bit angry when they were only given back their claimed territories while the rest of Germany came under Russian occupation, but they couldn't really do anything about it, so they just went back to fighting the Entente. After the Second Weltkrieg, Savinkov had a realization. With the Entente and the syndicalists still at war and with the US in a civil war, he could invade whoever he wanted without anyone stopping him. So that's exactly what he did. First, Russia easily invaded the entirety of the Balkans, setting up puppet regimes and redrawing borders wherever they saw fit. After the Balkan conquest, Savinkov moved on to China, where he annexed Manchuria, set up a puppet regime in half of Manchuria, integrated the rest of Manchuria into Russia, and he also annexed East Turkestan for the hell of it. And for his last conquest, Savinkov established a puppet regime in Iran and annexed part of North Iran by threatening to completely obliterate the idea of an Iranian state if they didn't comply. While the Entente and the Third International were not happy with this new Russian empire, they couldn't really do anything about it because they were still fighting each other, so for the time being they were forced to angrily glare at Savinkov's empire. In the post-war world, Russia has surprisingly managed to keep its status as the leading world power. While Savinkov's death in 1960 almost caused a civil war in Russia and its subjects because Savinkov decided that as his final act on this earth he would troll the entire Russian population by giving absolute control of Russia to then-crowned Prince Dmitry Romanovich Romanov, not to be confused with Dmitry Pavlovich Romanov, but fortunately the crisis was averted as the new Tsar decided that he wanted a constitutional Tsardom instead of an autocratic Tsardom, and that's the government Russia has stuck with to this day. Over the years, Russia would grant more and more autonomy and eventually independence to most of its vassals, and while a lot of those vassals didn't particularly like the fact that the Russians had invaded and then occupied them for a couple of years, they've all decided to maintain strong military and economic ties with Russia, partly because the alternative is negotiating with the syndicalists, partly because they were already so dependent on Russia that if they severed those ties, they would collapse into failed states. In the modern day, Russia is a constitutional monarchy, it is an absurdly militarized society, and through sheer dumb luck, it has remained the dominant power in Europe and quite possibly the world. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and consider supporting me on Patreon like these people up on screen so I can keep making videos like this one. Remember to always drink and drive, and I'll see you all on the next one. Roll the Hoi4.